Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is another video in my Agatha Christie read-through project series. Now I've just posted one recently, but that's because I've been reading a lot of Agatha Christie and I kind of got behind in these videos, so I'm doing another one right away, another 3 Agatha Christie's in my read-through. And first up is A Murder is Announced from 1950. This is a Miss Marple, and I really enjoyed this one. It's set in Chipping Cleghorn, which I just love that. I just love that name. This one has a pretty big cast of characters, so I wrote them all down, but I don't tend to have a hard time keeping track of a big cast of characters. Let me give you a brief synopsis of the book. Then I'm going to talk about some of the things that I look for in my read-through project, and then I'm going to get spoilery. So I will let you know well ahead of time if, when I'm going to get spoilery so that you can fast forward if this is a book that you have not read yet. The book opens with the villagers in Chipping Cleghorn at their breakfast tables reading the newspaper, where they come across this announcement. A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October 29th at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. And so it's just so intriguing. Everybody is so intrigued by this announcement in the paper. And of course they're going to show up, because why wouldn't you? It sounds like it's going to be great fun. I love that it's set on my birthday. October 29th is my birthday, so I think that's fantastic. Everybody arrives at the house, and then the lights flicker, the lights go out, and the door opens, and a man shows up in the door saying, you know, put him up or whatever. And then that man ends up shot. So what exactly happened that night at Little Paddocks? Okay, so a few things that I look out for in this read-through project. In my Agatha Christie universe, I like to keep track of who's who and whether or not characters appear in multiple books, especially across series. I find that really interesting. I also am keeping track of when she quotes Shakespeare, because she seems to do that an awful lot. So a few things that I noted. In this book, we have D.I. Craddock, who is Sir Henry Clithering's godson. And Sir Henry Clithering has appeared in multiple previous Miss Marples: Murder at the Vicarage, The Body in the Library, and 13 Problems. And Sir Henry loves Miss Marple, and so I love it whenever Sir Henry describes Miss Marple. And in this book, he says, she's just the first detective God ever made. Natural genius cultivated in suitable soil. Isn't that great? There's a Shakespeare reference fairly early on where D.I. Craddock observes that Mrs. Hayes would make a good Rosalind. So that's good. And then Sir Henry says, once more, a murder is announced for the benefit and enjoyment of Miss Marple. I thought that was great. We got our first appearance of Miss Marple on page 78, and there's this great description. Miss Jane Marple was very nearly, if not quite, as Craddock had pictured her. She was far more benignant than he had imagined, and a good deal older. She seemed indeed very old. She had snow-white hair and a pink crinkled face and very soft, innocent blue eyes. And she was heavily enmeshed in fleecy wool. Wool round her wool round her shoulders in the form of a lacy cape, and wool that she was knitting and which turned out to be a baby's shawl. And then just a couple pages later, Marple herself says, really, I have no gifts. No gifts at all, except perhaps a certain knowledge of human nature. People, I find, are apt to be far too trustful. I'm afraid that I have a tendency always to believe the worst. Not a nice trait, but so often justified by subsequent events. And then we have a quote from Miss Marple herself, which is indicative of her investigative style. First it says, the old lady was very charming in her gentle gossipy fashion. She revealed herself almost at once to be one of those old ladies who have a constant preoccupation with burglars. So she really lets herself be viewed in ways by other people that will make her unassuming, or they will underrate her. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. She murmured under her breath, "People are really very alike everywhere." Okay, so let's dive now into some specific stuff. I like to talk about how Agatha Christie peppers clues, let's say, throughout the mystery, and how she writes her mystery and whether or not they're solvable. So this is going to get a little bit spoilery, so I'm going to put spoiler on the screen now. If you've not read A Murder is Announced, then just fast forward until you don't see spoiler on the screen anymore. There's a great example of how Agatha Christie hides clues amongst everyday things. And so I'm going to look at that part. So we have Inspector Craddock is talking to Miss Blacklock, the owner of Little Paddocks, and Miss Bunner, who is a friend of hers who lives there as well. "Where were you standing, Miss Blacklock?" "She was over by the table. She'd got that vase of violets in her hand," said Miss Bunner breathlessly. "I was over here," Miss Blacklock went over to the small table by the archway. "Actually, it was the cigarette box I'd got in my hand." And then we go on and he investigates the bullet holes in the wall and stuff. And then we have, "It's all right, Dora dear. Don't get excited. It's so bad for you. Everything's quite all right. We've had a nasty experience, but it's over now." She added, "You must pull yourself together for my sake, Dora. I rely on you, you know, to keep the house going. Isn't it the day for the laundry to come?" "Oh dear me, Letty, how fortunate you reminded me. I wonder if they'll return that missing pillowcase. I must make a note in the book about it. I'll go and see to it at once." "And take those violets away," said Miss Blacklock. "There's nothing I hate more than dead flowers." "What a pity. I picked them fresh yesterday. They haven't lasted at all. Oh dear, I must have forgotten to put any water in the vase. Fancy that. I'm always forgetting things. Now I must go and see about the laundry. They may be here any moment." And she bustled away, looking quite happy again. That's a great example of how Agatha Christie hides clues in amongst everyday life. So you get this, like, what looks like just this boring conversation between Miss Blacklock and Miss Bunner about the laundry and household items. That you might miss how important it is that the violets are dead, that there's no water left in the violets, because as it turns out, Miss Blacklock poured the water over the cord on the lamp to cause it to fuse, to cause the lights to go out. So it's actually a really key clue that you might miss. First, because Dora has already been introduced out to us as a little bit forgetful and bumbling and well-meaning, but, you know, not very reliable. And so when she said you were holding the vase of violets, and Miss Blacklock says, "No, I wasn't. I was over here with a cigarette case," you are already primed to believe Miss Blacklock, not Bunner. And then you miss the importance of this clue that the violets have no water left in them and therefore they died. So brilliant. Another example where she hides the real clue amongst something else. And so in the story, so the police discover that people are in and out of each other's houses in this village all the time. The doors are never locked and people are constantly in and out, focusing on the fact that anyone could have come into Little Paddocks, which makes sense because they're looking for the murderer and how, you know, how that all happened. They focus on the murderer getting into Little Paddocks and how easy that is. But by doing that, Agatha Christie minimizes the possibility of the real killer going to other houses, which is what happens because Miss Blacklock goes into Colonel Easterbrook's house to steal his revolver for the crime. So it's another great example of that. Okay, moving on. We get at the very beginning, starting from page 20, Dora accidentally says Lottie instead of Letty. And as the story continues, we discover that there are two sisters, Letitia Blacklock and Charlotte Blacklock. Charlotte is called Lottie and Letitia is called Letty. And Dora grew up with these sisters. And so the first time it happens, you know, you just think, oh, she's just mixing up the sisters in her mind. But then it happens a couple more times. And of course, I made a note of it because I was starting to wonder whether or not that was actually significant. Then there was the constant repetition of how the central heating is on when all the guests show up at Little Paddocks for this murder. They all comment on the fact that central heating is on and that nobody else has turned their central heating on yet, that it's too early for that. But of course, Miss Blacklock needed the central heating on so that there didn't have to be a fire, because if there was a fire, there would be light in the room and too many people would see what was about to happen. All right. Then there's this very interesting instance of Miss Marple saying Lottie herself, which I wonder is a way of, like, it's coming out, that it's rattling around in her subconscious the truth of the case, and I actually haven't been able to figure out whether she's doing it on purpose or not. She's having a conversation with the vicar's wife, her friend Bunch, and they're talking about Pip and Emma, who are characters that the police are trying to find because they are potential inheritors of this massive will. And she says, "My dear, it isn't nearly as simple as that. There are all sorts of ramifications and combinations. There's Pip's wife, if he's married, or Emma's husband. There's their mother. She's an interested party, even if she doesn't inherit direct. If Lottie Blacklock hasn't seen her for 30 years, she'd probably not recognize her now. One elderly woman is very like another. You remember Miss Witherspoon drew her own, and Mrs. Bartlett's old age pension through Mrs. Bartlett, though Mrs. Bartlett had been dead for years. Anyway, Miss Blacklock's short-sighted. Haven't you noticed how she peers at people?" So again, you get this, it's all about, really you're thinking that it's about Pip's mother, and whether or not they would recognize her now. But when you know the end, you can come back to this and see she's already in her mind considering the fact that Letitia isn't actually Letitia Blacklock, that she's actually Charlotte Blacklock, and she has just taken her sister's identity. And so even when she talks about recognizing people 30 years later and one elderly woman is very like another, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And then Miss Marple, as she's thinking about Patrick, says, "Only sometimes the most amazing impersonations did happen. You could get away with a great deal if you had enough audacity." And again, she's talking about Patrick, but that turns out to be the truth about Miss Blacklock. And so already she's starting to think about impersonations, and that becomes a big part of this story. Craddock says about Marple, "Dangerous as a rattlesnake if you only knew." And so he totally changes his opinion about her throughout the story, which is great. And then we get these letters are found from Letitia to Charlotte. They find these letters in the attic. And so my first thought when I read this was, why does Miss Blacklock have letters that she wrote to her sister Charlotte? Why doesn't she have the letters that Charlotte wrote to her? And so that's a big clue right there that she's actually Charlotte, not Letitia. And then a big clue, I thought was a big clue, in the letter that Marple reads, these letters that I just talked about, the quote is, "Sonia had just come in and is closing and unclosing her hands like an angry cat sharpening its claws." And then one page later, "Closing and unclosing her hands like an angry cat," murmured Craddock. "You know, that reminds me of someone." And it reminded me of someone too, because just a few pages earlier, Craddock is having an interview with Mrs. Haynes. 6 pages earlier, he saw her face go white and her hands close and unclose themselves. And then again on page 210. I thought that was interesting. By having Craddock repeat the phrase, Christie is shining a big spotlight on Philippa as an impersonator. The reader misses out on the more subtle clues that Miss Blacklock is also an impersonator. the more important of the impersonations. So there are multiple impersonators in this book, but because of that, you miss out on the most important of the impersonators. Because right around in there, in those letters, we have Letitia spells inquiries with an E, that's in the letters, but Miss Blacklock spells them with an I. So that's a big clue, again, that it's not the same person. And then we have another impersonator, Julia, because Julia is actually Emma that they were looking for. So we have multiple impersonators in this story. Two almost throwaway comments that I thought were interesting. Philippa's deserter husband died saving a child from being hit by a truck. And Emma impersonated Julie. Emma, who impersonated Julie, fought with the French resistance. So we get two people who are neither 100% good or 100% bad, and it's all related to the war. I find that interesting. So Philippa's husband is a deserter, and that's what he, would be known for and despised because of, and yet he died saving a child from being hit by a truck. And so, he's not 100% bad. There was good in him. And then the same with Emma. Emma did impersonate another person in hopes of gaining money, and yet she spent her war helping the French resistance. So I thought that was interesting. And then towards the end, and this is connected to how Miss Marple views justice, I think, Miss Marple's voice dropped. It was no longer excited and pleased. It was quiet and remorseless. I knew then something had got to be done quickly. So for Miss Marple, justice is very important. It's key. So I really, really loved A Murder is Announced, and it is currently sitting at number 17 on my rankings. I have read 55 books now, and so A Murder is Announced. I loved it, and I'm pretty sure I gave it 5 stars. I didn't mark it, but I'm pretty sure I gave it 5 stars, and yet it is sitting at 17th place on my listings. Okay, and then I read Three Blind Mice and Other Stories, also from 1950. This one contains 9 short stories, and I rated each one of them and then kind of came up with an average rating for the book. And so I ended up giving it 4 stars, which is a high rating for me for short stories. But I did enjoy the ones in here. Most of all, I enjoyed Three Blind Mice, which is a long short story because it's around 80 pages. It has a fantastic opening. It was very cold. The sky was dark and heavy with unshed snow. A man in a dark overcoat with his muffler pulled up round his face and his hat pulled down over his eyes came along Culver Street and went up the steps of number 74. He put his finger on the bell and heard it shrilling in the basement below. I liked that. Monkswool Manor Guest House is run by Molly and Giles Davis, 2 miles from anywhere, and they have just a few guests. Mrs. Boyle, Major Metcalf, Mr. Wren, and Mr. Paravincini. They are snowed in, the phone is out, but Sergeant Trotter also shows up on skis in order to help them out. It was a fantastic short story, and I really liked it. Next up, we have Strange Jest, which is also in Miss Marple's Final Cases, and I gave that one 4 stars. That was a classic short story, just 15 pages. Miss Marple is described as gentle, fuzzy-looking, elderly spinster. And there's another example of a Jane character. Aside from Miss Marple, there's another character named Jane. I think it's interesting. Agatha Christie seems to really like that name. Jane tells us you're the last word in sleuths, Miss Marple. The old lady's eyes twinkled, but she protested modestly. Oh no, nothing of the kind. It's just that living in a village as I do, one gets to know so much about human nature. And then another quote from Marple, the depravity of human nature is unbelievable. And then another quote from Marple, Please forgive me, so apt I know to fly off at a tangent, but one thing does remind one of another, and sometimes that is helpful, and that is 100% her investigative technique there. So yeah, I enjoyed Strange Jest as well. And then we have the tape measure murders, which is also in Miss Marple's final cases. I gave that one 3.5 stars. It's set in St. Mary Mead. Here's a quote from here's a quote. Miss Marple, that sweet-faced and some said vinegar-tongued elderly spinster who lived in the house next to the rectory. It has Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack, who were also in Murder at the Vicarage and The Body in the Library. And then we have the case of the Perfect Maid, which I also gave 3.5 stars to, which is also in Miss Marple's final cases, also set in St. Mary Mead with Inspector Slack. And then the case of the Caretaker, I also gave 3.5 stars to, also a Miss Marple set in St. Mary Mead. And interestingly enough, because when I read it, there were a lot of similarities to Endless Night, and I think this short story was the seed that grew into the full-length novel Endless Night. So I thought that was interesting. The Third Floor Flat was first published in 1929, so it's an earlier one of her short stories. This one is a Hercule Poirot. I gave it 3.5 stars. He takes a flat in this apartment building under the name of O'Connor, but there is never any indication of why he does that, so I find that fascinating. Here's a quote. Once, mademoiselle, I loved a beautiful young English girl who resembled you greatly, but alas, she could not cook. So perhaps everything was for the best. I always make note if there's any comment about Poirot's romantic life because there doesn't seem to be very many. And then we have The Adventure of Johnny Waverley from 1923. I gave that one 3.5 stars. That one is a Poirot as well, narrated by Hastings. I like it when Hastings is in the stories. And then 4 and 20 Blackbirds from 1940. I gave that one 3.5 stars. It's also called Poirot and the Regular Customer. That one has Poirot. It also mentions his valet, George. And again, that one had a lot to do with order and method, which is a big investigative style of Poirot's. Then we have The Love Detectives from 1926. This one I gave 4 stars to. It's also called At the Crossroads, and this is a Harley Quinn. So we have Mr. Satterthwaite, an onlooker at life. He's described in the story as an onlooker at life. A man is murdered in his library, and we have Harley Quinn, who is a very mysterious character, and there are so many kind of connections with or implications to commedia dell'arte, which is a very, very early form of theater in Italy. And one of the characters, it had stock characters, and one of them was Harlequin, a prototype of the romantic hero. And so I thought that was just an interesting tidbit there. And then this one also is a short story that grew into a later full-length novel, because I think that she used an idea from this story, so not the full thing, but an idea from this story in Murder at the Vicarage 4 years later. So that's 3 Blind Mice. This one, even though I gave it 4 stars, I really do enjoy it. It's currently sitting at number 37 on my rankings list of 55 books, which is letting you know just how many of these books I am ranking 4, 4.5, and 5 stars. So I thought that was really interesting. And then last but not least, I read They Came to Baghdad, which is from 1951. It's one of Agatha Christie's espionage thrillers that is set in Iraq. And I gave this one 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. The back of this one I thought was slightly misleading, but you have all of these people converging on Baghdad and mysterious events occurring. We hear the story mostly through Victoria Jones, who gets herself to Baghdad because she fleetingly met Edward in London and kind of had developed this massive crush on him. So she gets herself a job as a companion to get over to Baghdad so that she can try and find him, basically. There is a hilarious code phrase in this story. A white camel loaded with oats is coming over the pass. There's some Shakespeare references to Romeo and Juliet multiple times. Parting is such sweet sorrow. And then there's this hilarious line. Nonsense. Archaeologists, she said, make splendid husbands. So I thought that was great, because by this point Agatha Christie is married to Max Mallowan, who is an archaeologist, and so I love that she kind of slipped that in there. Another Shakespeare quote, because as Hamlet very wisely remarked, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And then another Shakespeare quote, faithful to the tradition of Juliet, Victoria leaned over the balcony and gave a prolonged kiss. So I don't have a lot to say about this one, and I didn't make a lot of notes because I find that the espionage ones can't be solved in the same way that her traditional mysteries can, and so I just read these just purely for the enjoyment, and I really did enjoy this one. Trying to figure out who is who and who can be trusted, and there's some archaeology in here, and it was just a really fun ride. And so this one is currently sitting at number 14 on my rankings list. And so just because I thought you might find it interesting, here's my update on my rankings list. I currently have 13 books ranked as 3 stars, 3 books ranked as 3.5 stars, 1 book ranked as 3.75 stars, 19 books ranked at 4 stars, 6 books ranked at 4.5 stars, and 12 books ranked at 5 stars. So that's where I'm at with my Agatha Christie read-through project. So let me know in the comment section down below if you've read any of these books, because you know I love to chat with you in the comments, and I will see you for another video soon. Bye.